And I think I got a hint at what a slide's coming up, so let's see if anybody knows the answer. In 4th and 5th grade students with low math achievement. Sounds like me. Okay, so thanks, Ellie. Here you go.
All right, thanks for the intro, Mike. Yes, I did in fact study the effects of reasoning practice on fluency in 4th and 5th grade students who struggle with math performance. Before I delve into that, we are halfway through our presentations at this point. Nice job, everybody. And I thought some active participation would be in order to make sure you're awake for the rest of mine. So I have a multiplication challenge. What's going to happen here is I'll flash some facts up here, and I would so appreciate if you could respond out loud to those facts. It'll help me prove a point in a couple slides here. So.
32.
15.
42.
Okay. Awesome, that's all I'm going to make you do. And then I gave you some smiley faces that I couldn't figure out how to make any bigger than that. So congratulations on completing. Basically, those previous slides were to demonstrate a very common approach to fact instruction in many elementary school classrooms, and that approach is practice drills. This approach is commonly used because it's been proven time and again in the research to be a really effective strategy for helping students attain fluency in whatever it is that they're practicing. But like any instructional approach, some students don't respond well to this rote type of instruction, and that's what I was observing in my classroom for my placement this past semester and what inspired my research today. So today I'll be explaining why multiplication fluency is such an important skill and so foundational to math performance and proficiency, how students acquire or struggle to acquire this skill, and then I'll go into detail about an investigation that I designed to try and find an effective alternative strategy to practice drills for those students who struggle to attain fluency in their multiplication facts. So as I mentioned, I was in a 4th grade math classroom, and I was privileged enough to actually, in addition to my core instructional obligations, work with 4th and 5th grade students in small group settings, and all those students happened to be struggling with their math performance. One thing I observed in this setting was that despite practice drills day after day trying to help these students develop their fluency, these kids were not developing in that fluency, especially compared to their typically achieving peers. And so a question that I had right off the bat was, why was this the case? And I also wanted to know what sorts of changes could I make in my instruction to help these students achieve this really important foundational skill. So I turned to the literature and my water. And I found a couple things to really stand out. The first was the information processing theory. And this supports the idea that math is hierarchical in nature. So basically that students are required to master basic prerequisite skills before they're going to be able to perform successfully at higher level tasks. Excuse me. The second thing that this theory tells us is that there are two ways of processing information, and that is either automatically, like some of you did during our multiplication challenge, or in a controlled manner, which takes much more deliberate thought and effort. Cognitive load theory expands on this and says that when a learner is subject to excessive amounts of controlled information processing, that can actually overwhelm their capacity for mental effort within a given time. And when this happens, meaningful learning and definitely retention of information can't occur. So if we're able to help students acquire and automate this lower level schema, such as basic multiplication facts, then they'll be better equipped to process higher level schema, like multiplication of multiple digit numbers, fractions, decimals, all things that my focus group kids were having a really hard time performing in their core math classes. The literature overwhelmingly supports practice drills as a way to help students attain this goal of automaticity. But again, I was not seeing this in the classroom. My kids were being drilled during their focus groups with practice drills of varying modes to try and get their fluency scores up. And again, they were just not able to remember these basic facts. So I wanted to know, just what about these students? And studies point to various mechanisms behind why students with low achievement or learning disabilities have trouble automating their basic facts. Those include deficits in general cognitive or executive functioning abilities that I don't really have time to go into detail on. But regardless, the literature points to this need for an alternative approach to teaching these kids multiplication, because this is a skill that they're going to need in order to progress in their math proficiency. Some sources that I found did investigate strategy use as an alternative approach, but none have investigated number sense or reasoning practice as a potential effective way of helping struggling students attain their fluency. So with this information in mind, I was able to refine 3 research questions to guide my study. The first is, what forms of reasoning are elicited as students partake in tasks involving multiplication ideas? I also wanted to know how reasoning skills and number sense are related to fact fluency. And then ultimately, what I really wanted to know was, does a reasoning-based approach to multiplication instruction help these struggling students improve in their fluency? I had 1 month to complete my data collection, and in that time I worked with 4 focus groups. 2 were 5th grade groups, and then 2 were 4th grade groups. I randomly assigned an intervention curriculum to 1 group from each grade level, and then the other group in that grade level was my control group. For the control group, we just continued the curriculum as they had been doing it throughout the year, which was using drill practice to try and improve student fact fluency. But for my intervention group, I used the literature to develop a new curriculum that integrated drill practice with strategies, number sense, and reasoning practice. I had a few instruments that I used to assess the effectiveness of this curriculum. I had a multiplication pre and post test to measure the growth in student fact fluency over the course of the study. I also designed a strategies test, which I used to measure both number sense and strategies use using a quantitative and qualitative coding system that I can get into in questions if people would like. And then finally, another major component of my methodology was the use of recordings of those focus group sessions that I then transcribed and coded 4 forms of reasoning and strategy use in verbal argumentation and processing of multiplication problems. And my results were definitely interesting. Here you can see, I was excited to find that multiplication fluency for my intervention groups did increase significantly. The same was true for number sense. So between the pre-assessment and the post-assessment, students only in the intervention group were able to improve in their ability to make connections between numbers and number operations. And then the trend continues for strategy use as well. Those kids in the intervention groups improved significantly in their ability to use a variety of strategies to solve multiplication problems. Given that I had 3 significant improvements here, the next step in my data analysis was to try and define a relationship between improvement in fact fluency and components that I had implemented explicitly in my new curriculum. Unfortunately, though, a regression, multiple regression, is basically showing that the improvement in fluency cannot be explained by strategy use or number sense. This was a little bit disappointing, obviously, and could be explained by a couple flaws in my methodology. So I did have a small sample size, as I assume most of us did, and typically relationships become stronger as you have a greater sample size. And then I also designed my own strategies assessment. I used the literature to do that, but I'm not an expert in that area. So I could have ended up actually using an assessment that wasn't measuring what I was intending it to measure. Regardless, the question was still looming as to why the intervention group students improved so much more significantly than the control group students. And so I turned to my qualitative analysis to see if I could find any answer that the regression didn't provide me. And basically, this is just supporting quantitative t-tests. You can see here that by the end of the intervention, students in the control group used far fewer forms of reasoning in their argumentation and justification of multiplication problems. And again, the same goes for strategy use. Intervention group students were able to use a variety of strategies and more strategies in solving these problems than the control group students. I do also have some notable quotes that I pulled from coding this that I have in my kind of appendices slides that basically demonstrated intervention group kids' improvement in their ability to defend strategy use and also make connections. That was definitely not notable in the control group students. But looping back to my research questions, I do feel I was able to answer this first one in identifying the types of reasoning students were using, as well as able to see an improvement in those types of reasoning used. And then as far as my second one goes, my regression was really sad. I put a question mark on here just because I'm not willing to X that one out. I do feel like a more robust study design could potentially result in a more direct relationship here, especially because of a couple studies that I saw that were able to find a direct relationship between reasoning and operational performance. And then finally, for my case study specifically, a reasoning-based approach was able to help students improve in their fact fluency. I don't have a check mark next to this because this is like my to be continued, because I do think a more robust study design here would also potentially result in more substantial findings there as well. So, although I was unable to explain the growth in fact fluency as a result of my intervention that I implemented, pre and post assessments did show growth in fluency for these kids that were struggling with the instructional approach of practice drills. Future research would benefit from a larger sample size as well as a validated number sense and strategies assessment. I'd also like to follow up with these intervention students to see if they're retaining their fluency over a longer period of time. Yes, and so in conclusion, I think there's indisputably a place for practice drills in the instruction of facts. But if there's one thing this program has taught me, it's that differentiated instruction is required in order to provide access to all students to these foundational skills that they need to perform in these academic subjects. So I hope that my research inspires teachers to kind of reevaluate their approach to fact instruction in order to help those students who are struggling build confidence and reach those higher math goals as well. And Manya?
So in your regression model, you only put 2 predictor variables in.
Okay.
So just off the top of your head, what do you think might be other variables that could explain the increase in reading fluency if it's not kind of the strategy used? For math fluency.
Well, one thing that was very different between these 2 curriculums was I think that students in the intervention groups really got a boost in confidence in their ability. I was really able to, I think, and I didn't measure that is the only thing, but I think by the end they really felt like, oh, this is something I can process through and I can think through and I have alternatives for. Whereas really with the rote approach and trying to keep that very much a control, there wasn't a lot of tell me why you think that, try again. It was very much right or wrong. So I guess if I were to try and speculate on that, I think students just for sure got a boost in their own kind of perception of ability and what they could do with multiplication facts and their understanding of that. Yeah.
So for the control group, you just had them practice drill.
Yep, in varying forms. So I think they're still in my bag. But in addition to flashcards, which obviously we started out with, there's this popsicle game, that like various forms of that, but just the call and response, right answer, wrong answer sort of thing.
And so what, did you use a curriculum with the experimental groups, or did you just add other pieces to it?
I designed this approach, I designed a curriculum, which basically was lesson plans integrating all 3 of those additional approaches. And a lot of that involved, the main thing that was geared towards was having people justify their responses, which the literature says helps in conceptual understanding development. So a lot of me asking, why do you think that? Explain what you mean. And then along those same lines, having students answer open-ended questions so then they had the opportunity to kind of argue through that. And then also multi-step has been shown to improve reasoning skill if you have a multi-step problem in place that's going to, I guess, kind of push students to higher levels of reasoning as well.
Does an intervention package exist, kind of like a treatment package to actually address all 3 of those things?
Not that I know of.
Is that's what you created?
Yeah, that's right, yeah. Not that I know of, yeah. Really the only studies I found that were exploring alternative approaches had to do with the strategies component.